Okay, so The Pale King by David Foster Wallace. Yes, I'm aware that this background is still trying to figure this out, like what the best lighting is. Usually I have like a softbox LED light, but then I figured that since the last one just barely was enough to fit in this room that already has a ton of different instruments and all different kind of paraphernalia and stuff running around, clogging up space, so it became so claustrophobic that I hit into the unwittingly into one of the lights and they broke. So one of the things I need to get like a new LED light bulb for it. But anyway, that is a different matter. But this is it's been a few years. I want to say like 3 years I think since I've read The Pale King, and it is a little definitely not everything has been retained perfectly, even like remotely all up there, but it is. I have tried going through some different other takes on it and some synopsis, and I've reread for what it's worth the forward and the some of the reading guide at the end, and yeah, it is definitely a very very particular kind of post. It's not even postmodern. I'd say it's like almost like as with Infinite Jest, it's almost like meta modern, in the sense that it becomes like a parody of itself in some sense, and it's also that clashed with a kind of sincere kind of outlook as well. But yeah, he little background on it is that he posthumously published. So this is actually an unfinished work. There is no. It's not that it was necessarily to the point of Kafka, like, telling Max Brod to, his literary executioner to destroy everything that he ever did, like to burn all his work. It wasn't like quite like that. It was more so Wallace was definitely kind of in a state of incompletion, and that the novel definitely warranted a lot more bringing down. But the editor, I believe his name was Michael Preach, I think, to the forward, said that he found the manuscript and he found a CD floppy on a CD-ROM, and also like a floppy disk of multiple ones, I think, of written documents of like tons of different ones as well, and then those amounted to the printed manuscript, I think, which around the whole thing was like 1,600 pages, I think. So definitely quite big. And then he brought it down, and then I think Wallace, by the time he tragically, committed suicide, was the time I believe that he was in the talks with Little Brown and Company, the publishing company, to kind of whittle this down to a kind of more maybe 1/4 or maybe 1/3 of the size of like what it was. But I'm not quite sure on those numbers exactly. But anyway, so yeah, he definitely was in the throes of something very intense near especially considering like this. I do appreciate them not leaving completely all of, there's the chapters and all this stuff is like kept as is, but if I could, I know it's impossible to summarize, like especially a David Foster Wallace novel, but if I could, I would say it's about the IRS, a group of people that work for the Internal Revenue Services in Peoria, Illinois, which has that spot of Illinois has a pretty like significant spot for other Wallace novels as well, in short stories and various things where he brings that up again and again. And I think the reason he chose that is because the place of like the Midwest, of like where he spent kind of a good deal of his childhood. I think he was born on the East Coast, Upper East Coast, like Massachusetts area, where he went to school, I believe, and there was he went back, I think, sometime in his childhood, as he talks about, all the 4-H farms and all the kind of that kind of community and playing competitive tennis. That was all taking place in like the Midwest, Idaho. I'm sorry, not Idaho, Illinois. And yeah, I myself have also spent some time in Illinois doing work. Not quite as boring as the IRS kind of copyist type of stuff, but it was definitely a kind of drag as well. It wasn't particularly the most glamorous kind of thing at a nuclear power plant, building scaffold and stuff like that. And but yeah, it did, get me kind of enough money of doing overtime to be able to go to France after that, to travel and to do and stuff like that. So it's pretty cool. At least that was amounted to something. But other than that, I definitely, don't look forward to. Wasn't something I really have a fond memory of. But yeah, those long kind of, Illinois has some pretty good, like significant salient areas you can always go to. Like Chicago has a really excellent kind of artistic scene too. There's a great museum that had a temporary, sadly, because I would love for it to be full time, Henry Darger exhibit, and that was like very exhaustive kind of look into his life of like the artistry and his the massive talent of like his very intimate look to and to his like what even down to the very like to points of like reconstructed portions of his like own room too, like what his room looks like. They actually kind of made his house look like that too. Unfortunately, I didn't get to see his actual house area. I don't know if that's still, if they actually put that kind of in the Hall of Fame kind of thing, or if they kind of kept that as a rented unit or whatever. But yeah, he not the house, but the apartment he lived in, where he created like the Vivian girls and all that. So anyway, but yeah, so Wallace. He talked about making this. Oops. He talked about making this. The process of making this novel as being like wrestling balsa wood at a high wind. So you can imagine just how tough and like arduous that would be to handle something like that's a very particular way. That's like a Pynchon-esque kind of sentence, but it's also kind of uniquely his own. Lots of Pynchon-esque Don DeLillo kind of descriptions of long descriptions and like stories that start and then stories about these people, stories which I love to, which you could see, like you see the fruits of that coming like in Broom of the System too. You see like the whole the frequent and vigorous kind of like the switchboard operating company is that kind of almost as like a served as like a bit of a catalyst for like this kind of literary style that Wallace is so good at, that I think he's probably like the best at. I think is my favorite kind of thing that he's done is able to like not be pigeonholed into one genre, but like be spoken to only postmodernism, or to only be forever known as a meta modernist or new sincerity type of person, because like tons of people can get lumped in the same category. But I like the fact that he's able to write from different points of views too. Like that's a big thing. I think like Dostoevsky called, I'm sorry, Mikhail Bakhtin, I think his name is pronounced, in the polemics he did, Poetics of Dostoevsky's. He talks about I think it was the problems with the Poetics of Dostoevsky. He talked about how Dostoevsky and among other writers too, like classic kind of as far back as like the 16th century with like Rabelais, François Rabelais. He talked about how they had more so with Dostoevsky with the polyphonic literature of being able to kind of encompass a broad angle of different points of view, and rather than being partial to any one of them, being like, no, I like this person's idea the most, and I'm just gonna be I like my own point of view the most, like a kind of Woody Allen kind of dichotomy of that, and I'm sure even he's broken out of that. He's like in his 80s now, but like this kind of idea of being both being kind of very into one point of view, like with, let's say, Notes from Underground, but also being able to encompass and like address like somebody who's like completely opposite of you, like the very nihilistic kind of very most uncooperative kind of unseemliest people that you would cross in the street, that you wouldn't even look at on the streets. Those kind of the type of people that Dostoevsky kind of wants to give a spot to actually talk, to advocate, and to give a voice to these people. And that's in a sense of realism, is like able to do that. But like with Wallace, I think he does a similar thing of like these characters that are he has one of them is named David Wallace as well, who narrates most of the novel, but then it also takes on like so where it got confusing, because there's points where it gets self-referential in a kind of wry manner, where he's like saying like, well, hey, this is David Wallace. He says like in this like there's points where he says like David Foster Wallace here, and then he'll like mention himself, but then there'll be other parts where he'll like disappear into different identities like seamlessly, but still like kind of fraying or straying a little bit from the identifiable kind of narrator that we can name in these stories of people with their stories and stories of stories and getting self-referential, like with the I think it was in Oblivion and other stories, which I'd like to review next. Because I think with Oblivion too, he did with I can't remember the name, but it was like the so and so. Like it started with like this story was recounted to me on an airplane by another man who's himself was recounted by a woman from Idaho to this place and that place, and it got like into this recursive kind of thing. And yeah, I think that plays a good part in this too. Like the narrator, he's not limited in he's like almost like omniscient. He's like able to kind of recount all these different characters here. And I just want to give an idea of like the first sentence, because like just to give a kind of sense of the style of it. So the first kind of chunk of paragraph is past the flannel plains and the backdrop graphs and the skylines of canted rust, and past the tobacco brown river overhung with weeping trees and coins of sunlight through them, and the water down river to the place beyond the windbreak where untilled fields simmer shrilly in the AM heat, shatter cane, lamb's quarter, cut grass, sawbriar, nut grass, Jimson weed, excuse me, wild mint, dandelion, foxtail, muscadine, spine cabbage, goldenrod, creeping Charlie, butterpink, butterprint, ragweed, vetch, boulder grass, invaginate, volunteer beans, and heads gently nodding in the morning breeze like a mother's soft hand around your cheek. So yeah, that kind of very, like like it's packed full of just like these insane words that you have to stop and you're like, okay, so what is that? To Jimson weed, I think I have an idea of what that is. And then dandelion, of course I know that, but what is sawbriar? Like what's muscadine? What does invaginate mean? Like what is? You have an idea of it. Like okay, so maybe that you can kind of get an idea. But then there's also like even like simple. It's the words that seem simple, like canted. Canted. I had to look up too, and I still don't know what that means. But yeah, But I like the flannel plains. I like that because that's very fitting for Midwest kind of endless flannel plains. Anywhere from west of Ohio, Detroit area, kind of Toledo area. Although anything west of that toward, Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin and Michigan. I have a soft spot for Michigan too, having worked there for like a good few months. But yeah, and having kind of a second home there at some point. But yeah, it's that is a very kind of apt way of describing the Midwest, of like flannel plains. Like it's something that there's also little nature reserves too. And what I've noticed when I was in Illinois, it's not just endless kind of like plains and like rural farms and like kind of what would be the word, checkerboard kind of thing of like it's not just that, but it is. There are there are interesting kind of little isolated areas where you little bubble areas where you can kind of get away from that kind of mundanity. But yeah, it's and yeah, he goes on, and basically I think the one takeaway from this novel is, and I can't find it, but is boredom. Boredom is the undercurrent that defines this novel. It's how does one work in such a mundane, quotidian environment where there's no, there's no room for any kind of like anything other than just stagnation. And I don't even necessarily mean that in a bad way at all. Like there are people whose jobs these are. It's very important to do the boring work in the same sense that in the book Stoner, which is a brilliant kind of take on a slightly similar kind of view, and that is one of like the quiet life, the life that doesn't get registered into history and into the annals and isn't commemorated and isn't celebrated at all, because it's like how do you celebrate somebody's life that's exactly like millions and millions upon millions of other lives? and these are the lives, like I grew up with people that whose lives are, I still think of as friends and they're memorable, but like it's very hard to be like, how do you get these one few celebrated people and then pushed into, and the algorithm kind of pushes these few celebrated people, like why do these people get like the most traction? And it's like, well, they got lucky, and it's like it's a medley of different kind of maneuvers and different kind of convoluted phenomena is occurring simultaneously, and that's basically how. Then why is it then why are there people that are famous that aren't necessarily memorable? Why are there boring people that are famous? Why are there bad actors that are famous? And it's like in spite of that, it's like this weird thing where evolution, like life finds Jeff Goldman's Jurassic Park, life finds a way, in a sense of like life just has a way of figuring itself out. It has a way of people have, in the same sense, I think, that David Foster Wallace's characters in this novel, they all have different backgrounds and different things, and like, and they all have different ways of like dealing with boredom. Some of them are more kind of gutsier than the other. Like some of them are way more impatient than the others. Some of them can't sit there and they have to shoot the shit, and they have to like get the other one to like kind of admit, be like, listen, we're gonna be here all day. Like we have to like think of something to keep our heads intact. And that kind of friction that happens when there's so much boredom. Some people get very antsy. Some people can have different capacities for it. Like how do you get all these people? And Wallace himself was so committed to the book that he actually took classes of accounting for the IRS service to eventually kind of get some type of IRS job. But he took a good, I think, I don't know how many classes, but it was enough that he was able to kind of glean what their daily life was like. So rather than just kind of come from the outside and him just kind of imposter, just like looking in what their life was like. But yeah, it was interesting because like because there are characters, like one of the kind of upper kind of guys that are one of my favorite parts is like there are pretty relatable moments of like the how perfectly how Wallace is able to describe something like feeling nervous at a job interview, like a very relatable phenomenon that he doesn't make sound boring. Like he's able to make it sound like very engaging and keep you invested in the story. So he's like, and then this other the boss character I was talking about, who's like kind of higher up there, and he's like kind of like everybody kind of envies his ability to focus, I guess, his commitment to the company at the IRS for so many years, and he's just like so many decades of doing this thing. And he says that the reason in the gist, I can't find that. I'm sure if you look up maybe on Goodreads there might be this quote, but he says something like, in order to actually work here effectively, in order to actually you have to not only just drop everything else, but you have to almost in a religious sense like worship. You have to be so on fire, so ecstatic, and emotionally just immersed in the experience of this work. Like you have to worship the mundane to actually get the most out of this job, and to actually to begin to like respect yourself with it, I think is what he was getting at. So it's like almost a sacrosanct almost kind of appeal to it, like almost like you have to turn. And like one of Wallace's own kind of, I think from This Is Water, I think one of his famous quotes is like everybody has their own gods that they worship. They just choose different, they all have their own different kind of deities that they choose to worship. And that's kind of reminds me of that, is like he's basically getting at that the only, like, you have to kind of like almost, without even necessarily believing that that there's necessarily anything metaphysical, but you have to carry it out with such a zeal and such purpose that it seems like it's almost like a religious kind of calling. So anyway, but yeah, trying to think of what else. There was a lot of pretty dark parts where that take place, not just in Illinois, but it's down out in different areas like Texas too. Like there's a very grisly account of like one of the IRS workers, agents, his his childhood was like he came from a kind of abusive upbringing that where he I think was a part of or almost was murdered by this guy that that went around that there was a guy the way he describes it is like a very interesting kind of that's where he gets like very very kind of abstruse and like very not so technical but just like very like the long sentences that go on for pages kind of thing but still grammatically kind of intact but yeah he talks about how this like a very grisly murder happening and like that he buried this guy basically buried all these bodies of these girls that he killed that he like buried them in this place and he like the way he describes it is like he says different things like where like somewhere in a copse of trees and I thought that he was talking about like copse as in or beyond the copse like where the cops I thought he was talking about like the police officer cops but he was actually talking like cops is actually a small gathering of trees so that was an interesting kind of thing that inconsistency that I obviously on my first read actually like didn't get but and if you're listening to it too like you would I don't blame you for missing that too because it certainly went over my head too even in broad daylight but yeah anyway but yeah that I think is all I have for The Pale King by David Foster Wallace and yeah I don't know if I want to read you the end. I do really like the end. I did reread the last paragraphs or two where it's like there's more of a meditative kind of thing where they finally start they have these little breaks in the IRS kind of thing where they're office building where they all have kind of almost like a bell of mindfulness and stuff that they use to kind of like call center back to their bodies and to kind of center again because it's very kind of it's integral to their work that they're actually aware of what they're doing too. But yeah, so that is all I have for The Pale King by David Foster Wallace, and thanks for watching.